Okay, hi everyone and welcome to the webinar that's looking at creating authentic, valid and reliable assessment. If you could go to this bit.ly, which I'll put into the chat for us. That way you can just kind of click on it and you should be able to see then this slide deck, which will be good for us as we go. It means that later on when there's a few links, you can just easily click those. All right, so I'm going to start by just talking to you a bit about the goals for this webinar, and then we'll move into some stuff around how to make sure your tasks are authentic, valid and reliable, and looking at how to reduce variations within what we're creating. So our goals are for you to understand what assessment is and its variety of uses. So I'll generally kind of go over that quite quickly because I imagine most teachers understand the different types of assessment and their purposes. And then to understand what it makes an assessment authentic, what makes it reliable, and then what makes it valid, going through those to make sure that you have a good grasp of how to best create your assessment tasks to make sure that they're assessing what they're meant to and that they are doing that repeatedly, regardless of which teachers are marking or which students are being marked or what context they're in and those types of things. And how to make sure that that marking is not affected by all the variables that exist. So we're going to have a look at that last dot point at how to reduce variables in assessment. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Jackson. I'm the founder of Teachers PD. I'm also a PDHPE teacher, and so you'll have to excuse any references I make to sport throughout this because it just is a really simple way to make things really clear with examples when I talk about, archery and those types of things as we go. So first of all, this definition of assessment, which is from Google essentially, so it's the act of using a set of criteria to determine the extent to which a student has progressed towards achieving one or more learning goals. Now, I have slightly modified that quote that I Googled to actually make it more contextualized to us as teachers, but basically anything that you do in your classroom, outside your classroom, where you're using some kind of criteria, whether that be criteria that's just existing in your head at the time, or whether it be a written down rubric that you've created. But when you're using that to determine the extent to which students have progressed, so moved from where they were towards an actual learning goal, whether that be one that's a long way away or one that's quite close to the student, that's what you're looking at when it comes to assessment. And that's my kind of definition for what an assessment is. And so throughout here, I will talk about formal assessment tasks, but I actually want to look at more broadly at assessment and how to make sure all the things that we do in relation to assessment are authentic, valid, and reliable. So firstly, the three different types of assessment. So the first one that is often not used enough, I think, is the diagnostic assessments. So these are your assessments that are done at the very beginning of a unit or the very beginning of a year, where you're looking at what your students already know before you move into what's coming up for them in the new unit. Now, sometimes that might be checking whether or not they know content that's already in the unit. Sometimes they'll be checking whether or not they have the prior knowledge that they need in order to build upon for the new unit that you're creating. Or maybe it's actually just finding out whether or not they can read or whether they can write or how their numeracy is. And so there's lots of different kinds of diagnostic assessments, and I want to highly encourage you to use lots of them and use many different forms of them. But particularly when you're looking at the start of your unit or your program, you should make sure that you have a good, solid diagnostic assessment that you're doing with your students so that so that you have a good idea, a good understanding of where they are at, because only once you know where they are at can you really design the learning process to get them to where you want them to be. So that is your diagnostic assessment. The next one is your formative assessment, and your formative assessment is really all about feedback. Now, feedback to the students, for sure. It's very important that we are providing feedback to our students about how they're going in their learning, referencing back to where they were, and also future focused in your feedback in terms of where that's going. But your formative assessment is actually more feedback to you about how your teaching is going. So has your teaching actually enabled the student to grasp what you want them to learn? Have they achieved a particular level of goal or particular level of learning? And that feedback to you should then affect what you do next in your classroom. And so your assessments here need to be focused on your learning goals and focus on where they were and where they're heading to and whether or not they're progressing. And if they're not progressing, the feedback to you is that you need to change what you're doing with that student to help them to progress. Now, I know that's often difficult because there's, you have 30 students in your class that you have to differentiate to and cater to. But if we think about this at the very beginning and build in flexibility to our programs, knowing that our students all come at different levels of prior knowledge, they all come with different levels of skill that they're bringing into the units that you do, and they're all going to learn it at different rates. If we remember that in the design of what we're doing, it'll actually enable for better assessment and for a lot better learning for your students as well. And the final type of assessment is summative. Now, I love Eddie Wu. He's a great flipped learner and he has some fantastic resources out there, but I've just got him up here to remember summative, right? The sum of things. So your summative assessment is really what you're doing at the end of a unit to basically find out whether or not the students have learnt what you asked them to learn. Now, summative could even be just be done at the end of a lesson where you're finding out whether or not the students learnt what you wanted them to learn in that lesson. But again, summative assessment should be providing you feedback for, it might be to adjust things for the next lesson, but it could also be just to adjust things for the next year. And so I want to really encourage you to see that the use of assessment is primarily for feedback to you. And then secondarily, it's about whether or not the student got a good grade and those types of things. So you want to focus your assessments on whether or not what you're doing in your classroom is actually causing learning. And if that is your focus with your assessments, you will see a shift in how you use them. And suddenly you'll still get upset, I know, when you provide lots of feedback on something and the students don't read it. They just get the mark and go, yeah, whatever. Okay, but in reality, the main role of that feedback is actually for you to go, okay, this student didn't get this whole content idea. Were they away that day, or did they just happen to not click? Did something go wrong in what happened in that lesson? And if you see that then consistently across your whole class, then you know I've got to do something with that lesson. You need to re-teach that. You need to recreate that lesson for next year, it might be, so that you're actually making sure that your students are learning. And I've said previously that all these assessments need to focus on the learning goals for your students. So you need to constantly make sure that your assessments line up to your learning goals. And that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this presentation, is that when you're creating and designing your assessments, you need to have already decided what your learning goals are and make sure that they obviously match up with your outcomes, because your assessments, really, they're meant to be about the outcomes and those learning goals. They're not about the content. People often get distracted by the content and making sure that they assess all the different pieces of content that's in the syllabus. But that's not actually what you're meant to be doing. What you're meant to be doing is checking whether or not the student is achieving the outcomes of the syllabus, and the content is a way to progress towards that, but it's not the be all and end all. Students could show that they've met the outcome without covering all the content that you might think, or that the syllabus has put in there for us to try and cover in our classrooms. So I recently listened to this as an audio book, The 10 Mind Frames for Visible Learning by Hattie and Zira. Now, I really liked this book because it actually was different compared to a lot of Hattie's previous books, where he kind of focuses more on, the actual teaching strategies and their effect sizes. This book is more about your general mind frames as a teacher. And so he has 10 mind frames here that help you to become a more effective teacher and a more impactful teacher. And impact is really key for what we're doing as teachers, because if we can shift ourselves from thinking, that my goal is to make sure that the students are engaged and fun and having a great time in my lessons, to actually shifting towards, am I having an impact for learning? That is a big shift in our mind frames, so that what happens in our classroom is focused, and what we're doing is really gathering that data to see whether or not we're having that impact. So, excuse me. So from his 10 mind frames that he talks about, the two that I've picked out here that are key for assessment are, number one, which is the first mind frame, my fundamental task is to evaluate the effect of my teaching on students' learning and their achievements. So your job is, when you're looking at your teaching and learning, is actually to see your students grow, to see them learn. And then the fourth mind frame that he talks about is actually to assess assessment is all about my impact. And so that's what I was talking about before, how when we actually look at it, the assessments we're providing to our students, we need to actually think about them as being an assessment of our teaching, our design of learning, and the impact that's having on our students. And so if what we're doing is having a great impact, fantastic. If what we're doing is having no impact, then we need to change it. And yeah, we might have a great, fantastic lesson from exterior perspectives, but if the students aren't being impacted by that, if they're not being challenged and not learning from it, but they are, you know, having fun and engaging with it, then we still need to think about what we're doing with that lesson. It might be fun, but if it's not achieving and not progressing our students towards our learning goals, then we probably should reevaluate that lesson and change it up so that we actually are progressing towards the learning goals that we want to achieve. So the first thing is about having our assessments be authentic. Now, to create an authentic assessment, you really need to be making sure that you are connecting with your students, that things are meaningful for them, making those real world connections going beyond the classroom. So not just, you know, finishing that maths quiz for the sake of showing that they can do the maths quiz, but actually taking all those maths and those key concepts of maths that they're learning about and looking at how you can connect those into real world, into real projects or something for them, so that they can see the meaning to what they're doing. And once they have those connections made for them, it actually will increase the amount of effort they put in. They'll see the relevance of it. And then what you get from your assessments is more valid and reliable then, because your students are actually going about and putting in the effort to show you their learning, to show you what they've managed to achieve. Whereas if it's something that's boring to them, boring actually has a massive negative effect size in the classroom. It's the biggest negative effect size for anything you can do in your classroom. So if your classroom is boring, then your students are not going to learn very well. In fact, they will quite possibly unlearn things because they're not engaged, they're not learning, they're not even redoing things that they used to do. So really think about how you can engage your student through meaning. And that's how you're looking at your authentic assessments, making sure that they actually have a purpose, making sure it's connected to your outcomes. So that's where making sure you have your learning goals and that you understand your syllabus outcomes is so important for your assessment design, because what you want to be looking at is how you can connect those outcomes, because often those outcomes are more broad. They actually often have those real world connections for us, and or they have, you know, a slight step to get it to a real world connection. And so making sure you're looking at those real world connections for what you're doing is really fantastic for motivating your students. And, you know, I actually recently had a debate with my sister around the purpose of essay writing and persuasive writing and stuff. And it was more, I was just trying to flare her up a little bit, but also to get more out of her, because she's a really fantastic English teacher. And so one thing that she really showed me quite clearly was that her learning at school around persuasive writing and essay writing helped her when she was writing emails to get pay raises and to get back pay for things in her work environment, because it taught her to actually plan out her writing to show, you know, evidence of things and to give reasons and justify and persuade people in her favor. And so I think if you can, in any context, find ways to connect what you're doing, even if it's an essay, if you can connect that essay to real world things, even if it's making connections with authors around the world, or if it's having people post stuff up publicly where other people are going to see it and interact with it, suddenly what they do has to be slightly different, because there's an authentic audience for it. It's not just, they're not just doing it for the teacher. And when students only do things for a teacher, which is what they're so used to doing in our classrooms, if all they do is for you, then they already know you know it, and that becomes less purpose to it. Whereas if suddenly there's an audience that doesn't know it, or there's an audience that's just not you, that's going to be, you know, it might be put up somewhere on a website, and you'll then share that website with the year below or something, or it's going to be used for next year's assessments as examples of really good assessment tasks. The students will begin to just increase the level of work that they do. And it can be as simple as sharing what they do with the class across the hallway, and just saying, you know, when you finish this assessment, and what you're going to actually do is walk across the hallway and you're going to show this assessment to them, and you're going to talk about it and answer their questions about it. And so suddenly their level of prep is different, because it's for people who actually don't know what they're talking about, compared to the teacher who has all the knowledge already. So I've said it already, your learning goals are vital. Yeah, PE teacher, here I am, straight off to some soccer here, my favourite sport. And making sure that you have learning goals set is really so important for our students' learning. It makes your assessments more authentic, it will help to make them more valid, and it will also help to make them more reliable. And so being really clear about what your learning goals and your learning intentions are for what you're trying to achieve in a unit or in a lesson, if you use that to guide your assessments, they're going to be a lot better assessments. Now, when it comes to validity, the validity of an assessment task is really about making sure that you are using the right tool for the job. And so here I've got a hammer and screws, which don't work. If you try and bang a screw in with a hammer, it will just bend. It's not going to go in. You need a screwdriver or a drill, or you need a nail if you're going to change the other aspect of what you're using the tool for. But this is about making sure that what you're trying to assess actually relates to those goals, actually relates to those outcomes. If you're using some kind of assessment that really focuses in on the content and not on the outcomes, then you're actually not using a very valid form of assessment, because your assessment, yes, you're assessing content, but it's a content in relation to those outcomes. And so don't get bogged down on whether they've covered all the dash points that exist in your syllabus. You want to make sure that what they're showing you is working towards and achieving those outcomes. And so your assessments need to line up with those outcomes, line up with your learning goals. And that is part of how you're going to make sure that things are valid. And so here's a little checklist for you. When you're creating an assessment task and you want it to be valid, focus on your learning goals, which should come from your outcomes. So everything about your assessment should be based on your syllabus outcomes, because that's what in New South Wales, it's what our state demands of us. Try and make sure that your tasks are authentic. They have those real world connections and those types of things. Helps to make them more valid, because suddenly you're actually going to have the students showcase what they know more clearly. And that helps to increase the validity of your assessment task. You can also increase the range of task types. So this could be by allowing the students to choose how they present stuff, so that they can actually choose the ways that showcase their strengths the best. Or it can be by having multiple tasks that exist where the students are doing things multiple times. And that kind of portfolio approach can come in here, where a portfolio requires your students to, again, I'm going to relate this to sport. In sport, we tend to have these two types of trophies in Australia. So in Australia, there's the trophy that's for the person who wins the grand final, but there's also a trophy for the preliminary finalist, so the person who wins the competition. So you have one that's the team that's the most consistent over the whole year, and then there's another one that happens to be the best on the day. And so which one of those is actually a more valid way of assessing? And I'm going to say that the more valid way of assessing students' knowledge is when you're looking at that consistency across a time period. If you can see that your students are consistently achieving the outcomes in, it might be 3 times in 3 different contexts, then suddenly you know that your students really have a deep and strong understanding of that outcome. Whereas if you do a one-off class quiz and they happen to get it right, or they happen to be really stressed that day and don't get it right, then that may not be the best way. It may not actually be as valid as you're hoping. And of course, making sure that your assessment is accessible for all of your students. So making sure that you have differentiated your assessments as well as your learning stuff. So you want to make sure that you have scaffolds in there for the students who need it, that you might have a different task in there for students who need those for their individual learning plans. You need to just shift your focus so that it's shifting towards what their goals are for their individual learning plans, ILPs, and not necessarily for your learning goals, making sure that it's specific for that student if they are struggling with a disability at all. Now, this quote comes from Gronlund in his article, Assessment of Student Achievement. And so what he says is that performance-based assessments are typically viewed as providing more valid data than traditional examinations, because they focus more directly on the task or skills of practice. So by performance-based assessments, what he's talking about there are your more take-home assignments or your in-class assignments that you do across, it might take a few weeks, it might take the whole term for your students to do these assessment tasks. And so these assessments, where they're actually doing the outcomes of your syllabus, are way better and are viewed more valid than your normal traditional exam type responses. Now, sometimes we're limited to exam type responses. We have in New South Wales got our HSC, for example, which has exams, and they have their place, and they are good forms of assessment to a degree. But when you're looking at really following students' learning, you're better off having an exam as part of a group of assessments that actually show how your student is sitting. And some of those need to be performance-based assessments, because that will really ground your assessment and make it more valid and also more authentic, because you're looking at what the students can do, their performances, that kind of competency or mastery-based assessment type thing there, whether or not they can actually achieve the outcome. Not just can they regurgitate some part of the content that they had to learn. So in science, if they've had to learn all the anatomy, maybe in year 9 or something, whenever you choose to teach that to them, if they can regurgitate that in exam, that's great, but that doesn't actually mean that they can use it in practice. So maybe they need to actually be able to find the muscles or the bones on a real person, or they need to be able to think about how those muscles and bones function together to make us more stable, to allow movement and those types of things. So really thinking about how your students can be asked to perform things for an assessment rather than just do well in an exam. And here, I've already mentioned this too, and that's the whole spending too much time focusing on the content. And so, I know from my subject area in PDHP, we have a lot of content that gets jammed into it. Every time something new comes up in society that's an issue, whether it be social media or sexting or something like that, it just gets lumped into our syllabus. And so our content grows and grows and grows. And if we focus on the content for our assessments, then we're not going to have a very valid assessment. It's not going to even be very reliable. So what you want to make sure you do is shift away from that content and move towards your learning goals and your learning outcomes. So again, back to your learning goals. Now, when it comes to your learning goals, if you want to make an assessment more reliable and more valid, using, well, this is reliability here, using criteria and rubrics is really important. So here you can see the person, this is about hitting the target multiple times. So it doesn't matter who's shooting the arrow, so who's marking the assignment, how can you make it so that the mark given is consistent regardless of who's marking it and those types of things. So you want to use criteria and rubrics, and I would even put in there exemplars. So having really good examples at each level. So if it's an assessment task, for example, where you're actually going to give out marks, you might have a really good example for what's going to get them 12 out of 12. And then you might have a worse example that fits into the 7 to 8 mark range, or you might have another example that's for the 4 to 5 mark range. And so having those multiple examples then helps you to make sure that you're lining things up and are more consistent with your marking. And if you pair that with moderation activities where more than one teacher are coming together to look at the criteria, look at the rubrics, to look at the exemplars, look at students' tasks that they've submitted, and then if each of you do multiple markings of same assignments and then compare your results and do kind of what they do in the HSC with their HSC marking, where they do pilot marking and everyone gets on board with what actually meets this criteria, what meets that criteria. And then once you all are consistent, then you move on to doing the actual marking and having processes built in where you might then randomly check each other's marking every 30th student or something, depending on how many students you're marking. That helps to make your assessment more reliable because it's something that can be seen to perform consistently over time. So another way to increase the reliability of your assessment is that way of, how I was talking about that sports team that performs more consistently over the season. If you can have multiple performances built into your assessment, it will actually make it more reliable because you're going to see students who perform well in more than one task, in a sense, in more than one performance aspect, so that you can see that they are consistent and they haven't just fluked it once, but they actually understand how to apply it and transfer their knowledge across slightly different contexts. And of course, if you see this as part of a larger process, one thing that teachers often forget is that at the end of the year, particularly when you think year 10, year 11 and stuff, you're actually giving students an A, B, C, or D, and you're matching them up with a performance descriptor. And if they meet that performance descriptor according to all of your assessments, then you can actually put them in there regardless of what mark they got, because there are other things that affect their mark. Maybe they submitted an assignment late. Maybe they got really stressed and bummed out in their exam and did really poorly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not an A or a B student. It just means that they had a bad day. And so seeing your assessments, so as you build them and create multiple assessments, if there's a larger group of assessments that are coming together, then this process then enables better reliability. It means your marking is going to be more consistent. It means your identification of where your student is at and where they need to go next is going to be more accurate. And that's what we're really after here when we look at the reliability of assessment tasks. So our next little quote that I have for you here comes from an article called Success and Failure in Professional Education. And it's by Elot and Murphy. Sorry, I'm just going to cough for a second. And their quote says that explicit performance criteria enhance both the validity and the reliability of the assessment process. So clear, usable assessment criteria contribute to the openness and accountability of the whole process. Okay, and I would add to that, if you add to that exemplars or just examples even at different levels of that criteria, that will also help contribute to the openness and accountability of the whole process of the assessment. So you want to make sure that the performance criteria that whether that be your assessment criteria or just your learning success criteria and your learning goals, they need to be really clear to both you and any other teacher that's teaching or going to be marking this assessment or providing feedback on this assessment. And it needs to be really clear to the students too. So you can't leave things in syllabus language, for example. We need to transfer that language into language that makes sense to our students, and then make sure that the criteria is really clear and easy to follow for our students so that they can pretty much pick that up and mark it themselves before they submit it to you and say, actually, I think I'm going to get at this level. And so they will automatically know what they need to do to improve to get into the next level. They can look at those examples and see the differences between what's required for that really top mark or to be successful in meeting the criteria compared to the students who are going to struggle towards a lower end. And so having these things created and created really well in normal language for our students will enhance both the validity and the reliability of your whole assessment process. This is what we really don't want, right? This image here, if your assessment is trying to hit the mark and you have really unreliable assessment where things are all over the place, it's probably because you haven't thought about all the different things that are going to affect the assessment. And so here I know with archery, for example, if this person is shooting outside, is the sun in their eyes? Is it windy? What kind of bow are they using? Are the arrows all the same? How far away is the target? Has it moved distance? Those types of things. They're all variables that affect whether or not the person can be consistent in assessing where the students are at. So here, when it comes to our actual assessment tasks, we need to think about making sure that what we're assessing is what we create as our assessment task reduces the variables as well. So when you think of the variables involved in an assessment task, first of all, there's different content that might be marked. So if you're giving an assessment task and students can choose different pieces of content that they can examine, that will be a variable for the assessment task as it comes to marking it. You'll still be focusing on particular things across those contents, but if you have different content being delivered to you, that is a variable. Now, just make sure that you're focusing on your outcomes will help to refocus that and reduce the idea that content becomes a variable. If you're constantly focusing on outcomes and using outcomes and learning goals as your success and marking criteria, then the content becomes more secondary. It's more about whether or not they're working towards or achieving those goals, those outcomes for the learning. Next, you have to look at the context in which the assessment was done. So is it done over multiple days in various different lessons? where you might have had a student who was stressed one week but is quite relaxed the next week as they're working. That will help to reduce the variables. I know it sounds like it's not because you're doing it across multiple lessons, but it actually is enabling more students to better show their achievement levels. Whereas if you do those one-off assessments, then the context of what's happened in the life of that student outside of school is really going to come in and have a big impact. Or even if they're just a student who stresses massively under exams or under high pressure situations, if they have a one-off event, that generally is a high pressure situation. And so you need to think about how can we create a context in which the student is able to more consistently show their level of understanding. Next, our markers are also a variable. So how are you going to reduce the variability in the markers and how they use the criteria? So having criteria helps to reduce that. Going through those pilot marking and moderation activities will help to reduce the variables for markers. Or you can even just kind of stick with one marker that will help to reduce the variableness as well. Although if it's one marker and it's a large amount of marking, they may also become quite tired, and then you get variables in there as well if they're marking late or if they're marking in the morning, if they're marking when they're stressed or if they're marking when they're relaxed, will actually affect how they mark and how much time they put into each of the students' pieces of work or performances that are submitted to them. Think about your students too. Each student is different. And so if you can allow choice, particularly in how they display their knowledge, that it can be really key for them, because it then means that the student can use their strengths to showcase their knowledge. Whereas if you say they have to write a piece of persuasive text or they have to create a video, that is reducing things and making it harder for your students. Because if a student is clueless about how to make a video, they actually have to learn that as well. And so you're increasing the cognitive demands of that task. Whereas if they have the choice between whether or not it's a persuasive video or persuasive written text, a persuasive poem, or any kind of text that is going to make things persuasive, it doesn't have to be written. If they have a choice in that, suddenly they can choose according to their strengths to best show that they can understand the content, that they can achieve those outcomes, and show that they can be persuasive. So they might get up and do a speech for you instead of creating a long essay. I've talked a bit already about life events and thinking about how those affect what's going on with the assessment, and also think about outside help. So is this an assessment where your students can go to a tutor, the tutor will give them the answer, and then they bring it back in and give it to you? So maybe you're going to make sure that actually the majority of the work for the assessment task happens in class where you're available and where you can see what's going on. Or maybe you want to make sure that the assessment task is something that can't easily be Googled. And so they're not going to just be able to jump on Google, search it up and find an answer and copy and paste it, make a few adjustments and give it back to you. You want to make sure that it's something that is academically rigorous enough and difficult enough that actually they can't just find a simple answer. They might be able to find stuff that'll help them online, which is great. They should do that. And then they might need to transfer it across to a different context that's specific for them and where they're at with their learning. So the more we can reduce those variables in our assessment design, the more valid and the more reliable our assessment will be. The more we can create assessment tasks that are authentic, that connect to the real world, the more valid and reliable our assessments will be. The more we focus on outcomes, the more we focus on learning goals, the more valid and reliable our assessments will become. So that then, as we bring things about, as we look to reduce our variables, the learning outcomes, they're really key for being assessed. That's what we should be focusing on, and making sure that is clear to the students. Making sure we show them really clear exemplars. So I've got their plural, and this is exemplars. If you show them one, they're more likely to kind of copy it. But if you show them 2 or 3 different ways that they can actually achieve success, that will actually help them to pull the bits out of the exemplars that they need to pull out to then know what is required to achieve that learning outcome, to make sure they're getting to the top of that marking criteria or the success criteria that you've created. Using moderation activities, single markers, no single event assessments. I harp on about that quite a lot. I tend to prefer the projects and portfolios type approach, because that enables students to showcase things across time and gives them choices within that, whereas one-off single events that are time specific can be a little less valid and reliable. So that's ways to reduce your variables. Now, I've just got some information here that I've pulled out of NESA to just further enhance what I've been talking about here from other research that I've done and books I've read. So here, NESA say that we need to make sure that we have links with our standard reference assessments. So they link the achievement of the students to specific standards, that's your outcomes. And that's through evidence collected from a number and variety of activities and from observation over time. So you can see that in order to make this more valid and reliable, they want you to make sure you're focusing on the outcomes, that you have various different forms of evidence that are collected over a long period of time, and includes evidence and observations. And so this is how we should be thinking about our assessment. This is an assessment about whether or not our students are progressing in their learning and achieving things. And yes, we do have to provide them with marks at some point, and you do have to provide formal assessment tasks. But if we can see our formal assessment tasks as part of a bigger picture, it will help make things a lot easier for what we're doing. And it'll allow, if our focus is actually more on student learning, then you'll actually tend to find that the students will start to focus more on their learning, and the focus on their grades will begin to diminish. It's not going to disappear, that's for sure, but it will diminish. Another point from NESA is that your standards reference assessments involve teachers gathering evidence of student achievement formally and informally to make judgments and to facilitate and monitor students' progress using syllabus outcomes. So that constant going back to the outcomes, that constant use of evidence, both formal and informal, to make your judgments. This is, when you submit that A, B, C, D, it should be based on your judgments, not based on the mark. So if you're submitting your A's, B's, C's to NESA based on whether or not the student got 75% or above, or 60% or above, that's actually not the way you're meant to do this. You're meant to be going about it by working out whether or not the student fits and matches the descriptions that are given for students who are at that level in your subject or content area. And NESA have more information that you can go to have a look at to help you with that. This is also from NESA, and so you can see the central focus that they have on outcomes, and that should inform how you set your goals, what evidence you're trying to find, what you do in your classroom, how you're going to provide feedback. Everything just keeps focusing back in on those outcomes as you focus on whether or not they are progressing towards them in their learning. Now, valid and reliable assessments, this one's from ASA, so some points from ASA for you from valid and reliable assessments. So they need to measure and reflect the intentions of the standards. So that's making sure they measure and reflect the outcomes. Now, one way that I do this across my assessments is I actually have the marking, I take those outcomes and use them as to base my marking criteria. So rather than creating my marking or my success criteria on the content or on the question I ask, I actually base it on the outcomes that I'm trying to achieve, so that through those questions that I give the students, or through the project, or through whatever it is that I'm asking students to do, I'm actually getting them to see that that question is more about them achieving this outcome. And so I will take the outcome, whatever it be, and break down the verb, make it nice and clear, and have different levels to achieving that outcome, and make that clear in my rubric, in my marking criteria, because then I know that when I'm doing my assessment, I'm constantly going to be referring to the outcomes, to the standards, to make sure that everything is accurate, that I'm focused on the goals and the learning that's meant to be happening. Next, you want to represent authentic and significant chunks of teacher work, such as a unit of work over several weeks, not just a single lesson. So probably, I hope I don't have to mention this, but you should not be putting in an assessment, particularly not a formal assessment, that's based on a tiny little bit of information from the syllabus. It should be based on a larger piece of data. So that's why basing on the outcomes becomes really key there, because the outcomes will naturally chunk the content for you and focus on several weeks. So valid and reliable assessments also provide a basis by which teachers can show how their students have developed in their learning over time as a direct result of their teaching. So that's your knowing where your students are or where they started, that diagnostic assessment, then your formative assessments to see how they're progressing, and then your final formative assessment, or your summative assessment, that shows you what they've managed to achieve across that period of time. But they really are part of a bigger picture, and making sure that we see that in what we're doing is really important. Valid and reliable assessments are also fair and do not prescribe a favour to any particular style of teaching or format of showcasing knowledge. So That's where allowing your students choice in how they present the content, present the achievement of those outcomes to you is really important, because it's going to allow things to be more fair and not be so favored towards your particular styles or preferences for how you want to mark stuff. It should not, our assessment should not be about making your life easier as a teacher. Generally, a good assessment will make your life a bit harder, but it will be more rewarding and more authentic and more valid and more reliable for your students and for what you're doing across your whole classroom and subject area. They should also be context free. So that is, they measure something that all teachers should be able to do no matter where they teach. So obviously that will vary according to what your context actually is and what your topic is, but you want to try and make sure that what you're assessing can be achieved by any student across any area, particularly if you're looking to create things across multiple schools. That helps to make sure things are valid and reliable. If you think, could this be done by a school that's, if you're in the city, could this be done by a school that's in a rural area? If you're somewhere up north, maybe you want to think about, how can this be done by someone who's further south? Maybe if you do something that's examining climate, for example, they want to examine the local climate and compare it to something maybe, so that that's really easily replicable in another place, because it's not just the analysis of the current climate that might be hot or cold or whatever, it's actually that comparison that shows that higher level of thinking. And then your valid and reliable assessments are interpreted in the same way by different teachers. So that's your consistency, your reliability of the assessment, and that's what you're really aiming to achieve. And that's what ASA are going to tell you, and that's what I've also already gone through what Nessa tell us about our valid and reliable assessments. So I highly recommend that people use portfolios, and so do ASA. So another feature of well-designed assessment methods, such as portfolio tasks, is that when teachers undertake them, they necessarily become engaged in highly effective modes of professional learning themselves. So as we go about with our students creating portfolios and whatever else, we should also be learning, because they will showcase bits that really enable them to showcase their skills. And so we will learn from those things as well. So when it comes to thinking about it, getting to the end here as I wrap up, when you're looking at an assessment being valid and reliable, there's really two questions you need to ask yourself when it comes to this. One is, how possible is it for a student who does not understand the topic to achieve a good result? So, is this a multiple choice quiz, in which case he could fluke all the correct answers? I know it's not likely, but he could, okay? And so the less multiple choice questions you put in there, the better, because now suddenly we actually have questions that are going to require him to already have the understanding and not just be able to guess it. And then the second question is, how possible is it for a student who understands the topic well to then achieve a poor result? So that's why those one-off assessments becomes really difficult, because if there's a student who knows and understands your topic, but they've had a really bad day, or they're not going to tell you about stuff, they get really stressed out by exams, all kinds of stuff, suddenly it's possible for them to achieve a poor result. And so how can you do things to really change that up so that those two questions are both answered with, well, it's very unlikely that a student who doesn't understand can do well, or a student who does understand can do poorly. Now, I do have a couple of examples here about the process that I used to go about in creating assessments that are both valid and reliable and authentic. So this little picture here on the right is a template that I use, and in your, if you've got the slides in front of you, you can click on these, and they're examples of things that I've created for, this is HSC PDHPE. So you can see I've got the goal up here as my focus. Down here on the left, these are the understandings. Now, this is actually the syllabus outcomes, but I've worded them in clearer terms for my students so that I can actually give this to my students. And then I've got some essential questions to help me guide and to help make authentic connections. So this overarching question helps to really connect what I'm doing in my classroom to the real world outside. Now, the rest of the stuff here is more connected to the syllabus content knowledge. And then out of this, you then produce your assessment task, and your assessment task is going to focus on these. You're going to brainstorm some performance tasks that your students could do to achieve these. And if you click on these, you'll see that whole process, that design process. So if I click, for example, on this one, as I scroll further down, so this is now the live document, not just the image, you'll see here now, as I switch into the assessment, which is really your evidence of learning, I've got a brainstorm here of a few different performance tasks that my students could do that are authentic. So they're connected to real world, they're hands-on, but they're also focused on the outcomes. Okay, there might be some other evidence that I'm going to use. So these might be all of my formative type assessments that I'm going to use throughout the unit. They're going to do exit tickets. They might do 1 minute essays, those types of things throughout, so I can constantly monitor where they're at. But as I constantly monitor them, they're also working on this larger, more authentic task that's more valid and more reliable than these one-off things I might be doing in my lessons week to week. Okay, checking whether or not they're valid and reliable, and then thinking about the criteria. So making sure I have an idea of the strong content base that's related to that. And then if you go here and click on the assessment task, this is what I actually then create based on that. And so this is all very basic. You can see there's an exemplar for this, so the students can have a look at what a good one looks like. And then they have the outcomes here, they have the description of their task. But when I scroll down here, my marking criteria, I've literally taken the outcomes and reworded them. So this says clearly examine the sports performance needs. And if I go up here to my outcomes, so examines the relationship between physiology, explains our variety of training approaches. I'm going to find the actual one that I changed here. Let's just see if I can find H7. So explains the relationship between physiology and movement. So if I go down here, here we go, here's physiology and movement. So it clearly relates the various aspects of their training approaches, evident to their programs as cause for the expected adaptation. So here, that's a clear link to the outcome. And what I've actually done is I've merged a couple of outcomes together here because I can see how they overlap. And so here they're going to achieve 2 outcomes in the one piece of marking criteria, but it's very clearly based on those outcomes that I have for my students and the learning goals. So I was hoping to have a bit of more time at the end here for you to actually work on this. I will still give you 5 minutes, so you can click on this. This will give you a blank template, which is like the one I filled in earlier. So I want you to just have a look at some of the outcomes, maybe an assessment that you're going to create for next year. Have a look at the outcomes that you need to achieve. Where are the links to the real world meaning and for authenticity? What does success look like for those outcomes? What does it look like in practice? So think of performances to achieve these outcomes, not just things they're going to do in an exam or in an in-class kind of quiz type thing. And how could you assess the outcomes really well? And then, like I was saying before, using the outcomes to create the criteria that are used to mark will help make sure that your assessment is more valid, that it's actually marking what it's meant to be doing. So I'll give you 5 minutes to do this. While you're doing this, please, if you haven't already, put your name into the chat as well, and just get a copy of this template and start to just brainstorm something that you've got, find a couple of outcomes and chuck stuff down. And then in about 5 minutes, I'll wrap us up to conclude the webinar. Okay, guys, well, at this point, I'd like to just say thank you so much for coming and joining this webinar. I wish you all the best on this World Teachers Day. And if you are attending the next webinar, it will start in about half an hour. Please make sure that you do provide me with feedback. I would like to continue to improve what I'm doing. I think the only way for me to do that is to get good, solid feedback from people. So tell me what you liked, what you didn't like. Maybe I went too fast, there was too much in there, or maybe you wanted to spend a bit more time at the end with those resources. I would love to just get your comments back.